Hi, this is Phil Newman from Longevity.Technology, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Nikolina Lauc and Marina from GlycanAge's, and we're going to be talking about all things glycans and metabolic age. So very interested to have you here today, guys.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, wonderful. I mean, I think because we've got a panel session today, it'd be great if you could just introduce yourself. So perhaps, Nikolina, could you lead us off?
Sure. So I'm one of the co-founders. I'm actually on the commercial side, so I'm an entrepreneur by background, a tech entrepreneur for the last 10 years. And then our core founder and chief scientific officer is my father, who's a pioneer in glycobiology. So he started in this space 30 years ago, and the space is about 30 years old. And he stumbled onto GlycanAge as an aging clock about 10 years ago. And it was actually one of the first aging clocks. It was published on the 10th of December 2013, which is the exact same date and year as the first epigenetic clock. But a lot of people know about epigenome. Very few people know about glycom. And yeah, we're here to change that.
Great. Well, and of course, we're going to talk in depth about a lot of that. Lucy, would you introduce yourself, maybe?
Yes, please. Thank you. So my name is Lucy. I'm a medical doctor by training. I worked for a couple of years in the National Health Service in the UK. A year ago, I joined GlycanAge as a GlycanAge team specialist, and also have joined Janos Lab to do some basic research on glycans as well. And yeah, that's kind of my story so far.
Great, thanks. And Marina?
So hi, I'm Marina. I am a head of R&D for GlycanAge. I have been working on GlycanAge for the last 5 years, tackling a lot of the challenges of transferring a basic scientific knowledge into a commercial product, connecting the science, the background, the tech development of it, and then of course bridging it with our marketing to make it viable.
Great. Well, I mean, pleasure to have you all here today. And I guess the key thing that I guess we should maybe kick off with is the fact that people are starting to become much more aware of metabolic age. It's becoming a bit more regular in terms of people's conversations, whether it's dinner parties or trade shows. But are we kind of at a risk of maybe missing out on really what underlies all of this, which is really good old fashioned health and well being?
The first thing that I need to mention is that there is a general lack in the field of a common definition of what actually metabolic age, what actually biological age means. Because a lot of the companies and a lot of the scientists, they have their own, let's call it clocks. But these clocks, even though they all have a common name of metabolic or biological clocks, actually measure different mechanisms. They measure different aspects of aging. So some of those are actually referring to the longevity or the lifespan, and some of those are referring to a health span, which means not only how long you live, but actually how good your health is throughout your lifestyle, throughout your life. And from our point of view, the problem that we're addressing actually encompasses the health span within our definition. So we are actually interested in providing a longer, healthy life per se, and this is what the glycans are, instrumental for because they are the crucial molecules on top of the immunoglobulin G, which is the most present antibody in our blood. It is the defense mechanism from any sort of like diseases and any other, internal or external dangers that occur and that excite our bodies.
So really, what you're saying is that really your priority is health span over length of life. And I guess really from my perspective, I've been through many different types of tests, and I just hit 56 a couple of weeks ago. Most people in my family uh, reach their mid 80s and then they're not around after that. So I guess I've had a bit of a rendezvous with reality, sort of thinking about my being 30 years away from perhaps the end of my life. And of course, I'm hoping that I'm going to extend that. But obviously, I want to extend it healthy. Nobody wants Alzheimer's or anything of that nature. And I guess really having Lucy on the call as a clinician is really interesting because I represent really the common person. I take the tests, I get all of this complex information, I get guidance on what I could and can't be doing, and I have my own insights as to what's happening in the sector. But it's hugely complicated. So are we really at this position where age tests are irrelevant unless you've got some kind of clinical support or a clinician being involved?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question, Phil, that you're asking. I think it's just before I get to that, I think it would be useful to say that with GlycanAge, GlycanAge is not a test of metabolic age, really. It is a test of biologic age, biological age. And what we measure here is, the health of your immune system. That is the amount of chronic inflammation, which then provides us sort of the insight into how the rest of your body is aging. And I think that whole concept of biological age is still not something that a vast majority of clinicians are familiar with. I think that's only in the last couple of years starting to become more noticed. And I think there is a lot of sort of I would say pressure coming from the industry for clinicians to start looking at these age clocks as something relevant. But I think traditional medicine is still very much behind with this. The idea is that I think clinicians are mainly focused on treating what goes wrong when it actually goes wrong. So I don't think as a clinician, even I was trained not for my, first tool of action to be prevention, but rather, dealing with things when they actually go wrong, very wrong. So I think it should be the change in the mindset that we should be not just, teaching our future clinicians, but any other healthcare professional, both in public healthcare systems and in the industry.
And did you, as a trained clinician, Lucy, did you find that did the lights kind of switch on when you started to learn a little bit about what this whole longevity sector was about in terms of rather
Absolutely.
than being disease care, obviously being more healthcare?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's kind of about using that word healthcare. So, talking about health rather than disease management. And I think that shift happened in me for sure. And this is why I do particularly enjoy being in this health span optimization slash longevity field. But I think for as I said, many of the other clinicians, I think that shift hasn't happened yet simply because of the pressure there is in terms of chronic disease management. But that's not the reason to say that we shouldn't be thinking about it as a group of people, group of clinicians in the future. So I think everybody, no matter what specialty and where exactly is that they work, they should be thinking more about recognizing things way before they start going off, and focusing more on prevention rather than actually chronic disease management.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that as a industry, we have the opportunity, but also the threats, isn't there? So effectively, we've got the opportunity of evangelizing a new way of approaching healthcare, but of course, that means more people are going to come into the sector. So when you've got things like supplements or other forms of interventions that are coming in, really those vendors, they should be offering a test of their own efficacy. And I guess the thing is that they've got these marketing claims that they're going to be making, and really, should they be in a position where they are working independently of the other tests that are in the marketplace, or maybe should they be white labeling and partnering with an organization, such as GlycanAge, to really be able to prove the efficacy of their products and services to their clients?
So there's three utilities of the biomarker. One is in research, which is actually the primary utility. It's what we've done for the last 10 years. Second is physicians to help them guide the therapies they're administering to see if they're going to affect long term health outcomes. And the third is you as a consumer evaluating your lifestyle, seeing if your daily actions and investment in your health are going to pay off in the long run. And talking about different drugs which are being developed, therapies, supplements, all of these should go through placebo controlled trials with the addition of biological age tests to evaluate their efficacy for longevity because it's currently impossible to run a longevity trial in humans. So we need surrogate biomarkers. And the more we actually evaluate, the more convincing the evidence is that it's going to have this outcome. So before we partner with a company or somebody administering a therapy, we condition that we run a trial that does have a placebo arm. Otherwise, you can't take away the placebo effect from the actual intervention. The and a lot of supplement companies are doing this, and particularly um, individuals or companies developing new therapies, they do this by default. But with supplements, there's this other issue that they don't need to be regulated. So they're not really conditioned on the claims they make. So a lot of them don't do the research before they go on the market. And then the second issue is when you run the trial and you have a positive result, this is never going to be applicable to everybody. You never have a study where one intervention worked for every single participant in the cohort. It just doesn't happen. So if you as a company are partnering with this testing alongside your product, you always have this risk that some of your customers are not going to see the beneficial effect. And as you partner with the biomarkers, they're going to see on the biomarkers that they're not seeing that beneficial effect. So it's a very difficult commercial decision to make to say, yes, I'm going to include an objective biomarker because that will help objectively evaluate my intervention for these customers. And there's companies, again, doing this, but they're in the few because it's much easier to make this commercial decision and say, I won't actually validate what I'm doing. And second, I'm not going to give the customers the tools to evaluate it for themselves. So the people who are doing it, I have a lot of respect for them because they're putting in front evidence and efficacy instead of making more money.
Yeah, and I guess it's kind of one of those interesting things because I when I started looking at longevity 5-6 years ago, a lot of people were using the term snake oil, right? And of course that has disappeared out of the industry, but I do suspect that that's going to start coming back in again. And of course that means then that we need a set of standards, and there's obviously I've had a number of different tests. Most of my tests, including GlycanAge's, have placed me more or less at my chronological age, with the exception of one, which made me actually 8 years younger, which of course is great. I love the thought of that, but in reality, that drives a concern for me that there is obviously a lack of common standards. And I think reflecting on what Lucian was talking about earlier, bringing in the physician community and the healthcare community, I feel that there's probably a need for standards. And I guess that really, should we have those standards and should we be bringing in physicians and the wider community so that we can start to move forward as an industry?
One thing that I did want to say is that because different biological tests are actually measuring different aspects of aging, it is incredibly hard to actually find a common, even a definition, let alone standard through which they all should be working. So it is true, and there are already a set of rules which a biomarker of aging should satisfy. There is a certain set of rules on what an ideal biomarker should have. And we know, for instance, that our biomarker is, according to this set of rules, an ideal example of a biomarker because not only does it relate to the health of an individual, it also directly participates in the mechanism that contributes to health and the general well-being of an individual. So we are actually, there is a movement in the industry from a scientific point of view. There is going to be a conference in October where multiple, basically different scientists are going to meet and discuss biological aging and try to create common set of rules in how biological tests and biological age should behave and what should be the set of definitions. And it is going to be a conference on which there is also going to be participation from the side of physicians. Now, there is this whole other side of how, physicians are going to see this whole new set of tests and new set of information being integrated into their practices and how they are going to accept this. And I think maybe Lucia should continue from here on to maybe address this point.
Yeah, and maybe just before we do so, Marina, could you just tell us what the name of that conference is? Because that sounds really interesting.
Uh, the conference is going to be in Rovin. I cannot remember the name by heart, but I will search it and then I will tell it to you before the end. Yep.
So, how possible is it for us to actually adjust biological aging?
So we have actually done one study looking at the hereditability of the biological clock of age and how much we can actually change our biological aging through different interventions. And for now, this is sort of like a statistical mathematical model based on all the data that we've gathered throughout the years on large populations of people. But what the model shows right now is that the contribution of genetics in the biological age as measured by glycans is around 40%. So 40% is going to be something that you've inherited from your predecessors, and this part will be pretty hard to change. Now, the good news is there is 20%, which is something that we call unique environmental contribution, or in other words, a lifestyle. So these are the choices that you make. And it might sound first, it might sound like a very, very small number, just 20%. But if convert it to 100 years of lifespan, you can actually gain 20 healthy years just through changing your lifestyle. And this is not something to disregard. Now, there is another component, which is this 40% that is left. And this 40% is something that are shared environmental conditions. And this is something that we attribute to a combination of natural aging, epigenetics, environmental influence, and so on and so on. Because, for instance, we've seen that people who live in the same environment, like in the same city, sometimes have more similar glycans than the people who are of the same background but actually live in two different places. And now this component can most likely not be addressed through simple, interventions such as diet or something like that, but possibly they can also be influenced through a combination of very big changes and medical interventions. And one possible component in this would be possibly HRT treatment for women, because we do know that without this, there is inevitably going to be an influence of the normal course of aging or the menopause in women. But if we actually address this point, then we can gain more of the healthy lifespan than through just change of diet and a lifestyle.
Okay, well, I'll make sure that that comes out as part of all of this. But that sounds very interesting, and I know that there's something happening at the Buck in December with a similar vein. But Lucy, what were your thoughts?
I mean, I guess this conference, and any future conferences are just a statement that the industry and traditional mainstream medicine are finally coming together slowly. But I think it's almost like if you think about like docking and docking of different space stations, bits and bobs. It kind of happens slowly, and then at some point, like things just dock into one another. So I think it has taken some time, but I think conferences like this one that Marina mentioned will be a prime opportunity for people of different backgrounds, really multidisciplinary people to come together and discuss things. And I do have a feeling like there will be some slight resistance coming from clinicians that have so far used only traditional markers, not not of aging, but definitely of sort of disease, disease progress. So yeah, I think it's almost natural and healthy to expect that there will be some resistance, but I think we just need to find a productive and efficient way of communication. And I think, that's not something that's always been the best thing between science and, clinical medicine and clinical practice. But that is what we are trying to do with GlycanAge. And I think with glycans, there is a bit of a problem, I would say a really big one, since many of the clinicians, including myself, when I started, I knew nothing about glycans. So that's not something that gets taught in med school. So I think we have quite a big gap to try and fill. But I think we're doing well so far.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. And of course, all of these different approaches, again, are going to come to a consensus at some point. But inflammation is a very big part of people's thesis on longevity, associated obviously with aging and ongoing wellness. So, how best to tackle inflammation?
So I think there are multiple aspects that we need to take into the consideration here. So the first one is that inflammation has been recognized very recently as one of the new hallmarks of aging. Until now, it has been, discussed as a common denominator of many of the chronic diseases, but it has not been recognized as a hallmark of aging until recently. Now, the danger in this is that it's going to get a bad reputation, whereas in reality, inflammation is a good thing. It You need it in order to get a defense, from something like pathogens. But you only need it in a very, very short term, right? What you do not need is a chronic inflammation. So the inflammation becoming as a sort of like a normal state of the things functioning. And this is exactly the way we should try to move forward with the field. So there is a lot of research to be done here. There is a lot of discussion to be done here because fine tuning, preventing this chronic inflammation while not at the same time, addressing this capacity of the body to actually trigger inflammation when needed. This needs to be a very, very fine balance. Because, for instance, we do know already, and there are plenty of treatments that are used to address the inflammation, right? For instance, like corticosteroids. But we are already familiar with all of the, disadvantages of those treatments that, when you prevent the functioning of the body to actually trigger this very necessary inflammation that you are getting in a also a bad state. So this balance is going to be crucial for the future. And if I may add, so I have the name of the conference, which is partially also going to be addressing exactly this issue, and it is actually the Aesthetic Medicine Congress in Rovin. So it's going to be 5th to 7th of October 2023. And it has been recognized now in the aesthetic medicine field that it is not only the looks, but also, this whole functioning of the body and the health span. So there is going to be a whole longevity symposium as part of this conference.
Great. Well, thanks for looking that up for us, Marina. And so I guess that inflammation, inflammaging, that's across both genders. But of course, there's this horrible imbalance between men and women, which of course is the menopause. And in my family, we had a very horrible incident where my wife she had her menopause very early in life, and then she put on HRT, and then she got a very bad deep vein thrombosis through that. So I guess I have a personal interest in this, and I remember when we did our ovarian longevity report, it was just horrifying just to see how much the menopause does affect the 50% of the world's population. So let's talk about that and look at how GlycanAge and early detection of perimenopause is something that can help women. I mean, I'm really interested in that as a guy, obviously.
So back when the first aging study was done and the aging clock was developed, which was around 2010, maybe a year before that, we saw that men and women age differently. They had completely different aging curves if you looked at GlycanAge. And for men, it was a slow, very straight line with aging. And for women, it was a curve. So in a way, they were protected against chronic inflammation, and GlycanAge measures inflammaging, or this accumulation of chronic inflammation. And we look at both aspects of the immune system, both pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. Um, and it looks like women are protected against this pre-menopause. And then as they get into menopause, starting from perimenopause, they start to see this shift and their glycans become more pro-inflammatory. And their pace of aging in this transition is more than double than what you would usually see. They catch up with men and then they pretty much move on the same line after that. So menopause is one of the main aging events in women. And it's when you talk about longevity to women, actually they care about two things: loss of fertility and menopause, which is usually very different to men's concerns. And we also had a placebo-controlled trial that showed that HRT, this is through patches, estrogen patches, was beneficial and reverse glycan aging in a very controlled environment. Now, when we did that study in clinical practice and we followed women longitudinally, and this is still a very small cohort, this is an area of research for us, we saw that not everybody sees this beneficial effect. And some actually see the opposite and they start to see acceleration of their aging. And what we're looking to work on is within what we look at in GlycanAge, we look at these many different glycan structures. Some are specific of cardiovascular events in women, heart attack and stroke. And we have observed in a very small cohort, so this we're not confident in this yet. This is something that needs far more study, but we have observed that some of these risk markers change negatively on HRT. And these risk markers are very heritable. They have 70% heritability. It doesn't go into the aging clock. It's pretty much a constant. It would be the constant we would always evaluate. It does seem to see a shift. For example, with exercise, we see it go down. So your risk reduces with intensive exercise. With some interventions, we see it go up. So this is an area of research for us. We're trying to see if there is a precision biomarker that can be used to administer HRT to women that would help a clinician evaluate risk versus benefit for an individual woman, because every drug has a risk. And HRT so far is probably one of the most best evidence longevity drugs, because it does reduce disease, it does reduce all-cause mortality, it does influence an aging uh, process, but it is complicated. We're never going to have a drug that's just beneficial. It's always going to have some risk, and it's about finding ways to evaluate that for an individual rather than have this one size fits all, which is what we do in medicine now. We give you a drug, we hope you're going to respond. We don't really know what's happening internally. We just follow your symptoms, and then maybe we don't get the best outcome in a few years' time.
Yeah, and what about perimenopause? So just to sort of demystify that a little bit. So, what is the benefit of identifying that you're in a perimenopausal state? If you identify it, what does it mean for a woman that you can do in terms of preventing the effects of menopause being as negative as they potentially can be for some people?
So that's one thing we learned as we actually learned this from our customers initially. We had customers who saw this high acceleration and they still had a cycle. So we went back to the Twins UK cohort. We asked them for the menopause data, and we saw that we see the shifts in glycans before they actually get into menopause. They see the shift in perimenopause. And the problem with menopause is that currently you don't have a gold standard diagnostic. The way you actually diagnose menopause is a year plus a day that woman hasn't had a cycle, which is at least a year into menopause, but the symptoms of perimenopause can start a decade before then. The problem is these symptoms are very versatile because you have estrogen receptors pretty much everywhere, every cell in the body. So it can go from um, loss of memory, let's hopefully it's not that, anxiety, joint pain, palpitations, it can be vasomotor symptoms. Actually, Lucia can do this much better than me. But the problem is a lot of times it ends up being misdiagnosis. So you are having all these symptoms, you go to your GP, you get referred on to certain specialists, and none of them are equipped to tell you that it's menopause, and they don't have tools in practice to tell you either, because if they would look at hormones, hormones change on an hourly basis. So whatever they measure at that moment is not really a long-term representation of what's going on. So with glycans, because they have this long half-life, and some of them directly regulated by estrogen, we can see this long-term trend, like a HbA1c for estrogen in a way. So we're hopefully this will improve early diagnosis, so you know what's going on. You know you're not, you're not depressed. A lot of women get prescribed antidepressants for perimenopause, or they get diagnosed with fibromyalgia and get treated the wrong way for years. So let's take away misdiagnosis. And then, of course, it enables early intervention. And we know that HRT removes all the pretty or majority of the symptoms of menopause. So quality of life goes up. And it can be very beneficial in the long run. It's just about this precision element that we're still missing in practice.
Interesting. And Marina, what are your thoughts?
So I wanted to add to that yes, definitely we are. This is something that we're actively pursuing, that we're actively, looking at. And one of the first things, when we saw this increase of the speed in female aging, by which, a lot of the women at this very end of the curve look worse than the men, the first of the questions that we got was, yeah, but women live longer than men, so how come you see this? And the fact is, going back to your first question, that actually women in these years after the menopause actually have a worse health span than men do. So women who live into their 80s and 90s have more frequently issues with memory loss. If they do have cardiovascular issues, typically the consequences are much harsher for women than they are for men. So the health span of women is actually heavily affected by the menopause. So far, from all of the things that we have looked at, the one that has clearly shown a success is HRT. And we are now further pursuing this into, finding maybe if there is a mode of HRT which is the best. For instance, bioidentical hormones, then, what would be ideal modality of applicating those? Is it the patches? Is it the creams? Is it the oils? And what potentially could be the answer is that there is not one best solution, but that rather uh, there should be a range of solutions, and that different solutions are going to be ideal for different women, which is exactly where tests like GlycanAge's can help immensely, because they could help to determine, what is the best potentially modality of HRT for individual, rather than, looking at a population level. And then the second aspect of it is, so we've often been asked, okay, yes, so you have this biomarker for cardiovascular health, but there is already CRP around. And to this, I say, yes, you are absolutely right, but CRP is actually an acute phase protein. So CRP is inflammatory protein, which has a half-life of only 48 to 72 hours. So it is actually very, very short-lived. And in order to see any, relation between C-reactive protein and some cardiovascular issues, you would actually need to measure it in a very, very many measurements in a very long term. As opposed to this, immunoglobulin G, so IgG, on which we're measuring glycans, has a half-life of over 3 weeks. So it is a much more chronic condition that is actually averaging your state throughout these 3 weeks, which makes it more reliable. And moreover, these glycans are actually specific for women. So they're different between women and men, and there is already known in the field that there is an inconsistency between CRP measures and the menopause status, which is known to be a very strong risk factor for the women's cardiovascular health.
And maybe just because we have focused a lot, and I think rightly so, on menopause. What about the guys? The andropause is something that people don't really talk about very much. You might go out and buy a sports car, but in reality, there's a big part of men's health as well, drop of testosterone and so on. So, any thoughts on that and how that might apply to understanding with a GlycanAge's test, whether that's happening or not?
So we did with this trial we had in women, placebo control with HRT. They did the same type of trial in men, where men were suppressed testosterone, and then half of them were given testosterone on its own. The other half were given testosterone with aromatase inhibitors. So they blocked the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. And in the ones which were given the blockers, we didn't see the beneficial effect. So it wasn't protective. While in the ones that were given testosterone on its own, we saw the protective beneficial effect. And in a lot of practices that administer testosterone replacement, we do see GlycanAge go down. So it can also be a tool for men, but actually it's not the testosterone, it's the estrogen, which is giving the beneficial effect to men. And there was a very nice drug trial in the ATP, the mice, the interventions testing program, that had this type of estrogen called 17 alpha estradiol that extended mice longevity just as much as rapamycin, but only in the men, not in the women. So there is an interesting space that we should be pushing more research in of potentially estrogen alternatives for men, which are non-feminizing. And we're still waiting to see a large enough trial run in people, but would love to participate in one of those and see if we have an interesting solution for longevity based on estrogen for men.
Yeah, well, fascinating. Well, I guess there are many questions that we've dealt with today. So, Nikolina, Lucy, and Marina, thanks very much for your time. It's been fascinating.